The end of the year is always a time for reflection. And over the next few weeks, we wanted to take a moment to look back at what the AHF accomplished in 2025. And we're starting with something that captures the heart of this organization, a 2-episode interview with our 2025 AHF Traveling Fellows. As we were putting this series together, it reminded me why the AHF feels different. We often describe it as a family, and that's not just a phrase. It's something you feel in the conversations, and in the mentorship, and in the shared curiosity and willingness to challenge ideas while still supporting one another. If you're listening to this and thinking, I'd like to be a part of that, there are a couple of easy ways to get involved. First, join us at the AHF 2026 annual meeting, June 5th and 6th in Nashville, Tennessee. This year's theme is consensus and controversy, and registration is already open. You can find all the details at anteriorhipfoundation.com. Look for the events link in the menu above. We'll also drop a direct link in the episode description. Second, and this one really helps, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast. Wherever you're listening or watching right now, hit subscribe, leave a rating, and if you're inclined, leave a comment. We read every single one, and they directly shape what we cover next. So thank you for being a part of the AHF community. Thank you for a great 2025, and here's to even more growth, conversation, and progress for both the AHF and for you in 2026. Now, let's start the episode. Hello and welcome to the AHF podcast. I'm your host, Joe Schwab. For anyone considering the AHF Traveling Fellowship in 2026, today's conversation is essential listening. The AHF Traveling Fellowship offers early career orthopedic surgeons a rare opportunity to refine their anterior hip arthroplasty technique, expand their perspective, and build lifelong professional connections. Over about 2.5 weeks leading up to the AHF 2026 annual meeting in Nashville, selected fellows travel across the U.S. to observe advanced cases, exchange ideas with world-class mentors, experience diverse surgical settings firsthand, and participate in the premier anterior approach hip replacement event of the year. And before we get into it, information on the AHF Traveling Fellowship for 2026 can be found at anteriorhipfoundation.com/AHF-2026-traveling-fellowship. I'll make sure to put a link in the show notes. And that leads me to my guests today. I'm joined by 3 remarkable past traveling fellows, Jeremy Kubick, Qais Naziri, and Michael Field, along with Dr. Alex Sa, one of the host surgeons that these fellows visited during their fellowship. We'll talk about the real experience on the ground, the insights they've gained, and why this fellowship continues to be a transformative step for emerging leaders in anterior hip surgery. Gentlemen, welcome to the AHF podcast. I'd first like to have you go around and tell us a little bit about who you are, what your current role or practice is, and what year you are in your current practice. And Michael, I'm going to start with you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Field. I'm based in the UK. I work in the National Health Service with a practice between Ipswich and Suffolk and Colchester in Essex. I've been a consultant for 15 months with a focus on primary and revision hip arthroplasty. My UK training was pure posterior hips, and this included a hip fellowship in the UK before heading to Ottawa and spending a year learning anterior hips there before starting my consultant post. I'm currently purely posterior and working hard towards transitioning back to anterior hips with what looks like a start date of April of next year.
Qais, let's have you introduce yourself.
How's it going? My name is Qais Naziri. I am currently the Associate Program Director of the Orthopedic Residency at SUNY Downstate Medical Center in Brooklyn, New York. I'm entering into now my 6th year of practice. I did an arthroplasty fellowship where we did a lot of anterior, but when I came back to my home program, I was the only person in the borough of Brooklyn that was doing the anterior approach. So how I started off was very careful because I knew that there wasn't anyone around me that could possibly help or, hold my hand throughout this process of starting practice. So as I started, my practice grew. I did anterior and all comers, but what I lacked was the efficiency and the volume. And my practice is academic in nature, so it doesn't really have a lot of room for that. But I did want to see how the rest of the world operates. And I do feel that if you want to find knowledge, you have to seek that knowledge and you have to go and find it. And it just seemed like the perfect time to go and have some weeks off and go and learn from those that do this and do it very well.
And Jeremy, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jeremy Kubick. I'm an academic surgeon based in Calgary, Alberta. I'm associated with the University of Calgary. I'm in my 5th year practice, which is split between hip and knee arthroplasty and revision, as well as orthopedic trauma. I have fellowships in both. I also serve as the lead for our hip and knee arthroplasty division at the university, and excited to be on the call this morning.
We're so lucky to have you guys here to share your experience. We also have Dr. Alex Sa, who was one of our host surgeons from California. And Dr. Sa, many people who have listened to the AHF podcast have heard him talk before. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your practice and why you decided to be a host surgeon?
Thank you, Joe. My name's Alex Sod. I'm from Fremont, California. And like Joe, I was a prior president of the Anterior Hip Foundation and am currently Traveling Fellowship Director. This is really something that the AHF board wanted to get started about 2 years ago. So we've had the pleasure and honor of hosting this fellowship for 2 years now, going on to our 3rd year.
Gentlemen, if you could give us maybe in 1 or 2 sentences what the AHF Traveling Fellowship represents to you now that you've been through it. Tell us a little bit about that. And Jeremy, let's start with you.
Sure. So I have been an anterior hip surgeon since basically day one of practice without having any formal training in it. And so I really looked at this fellowship as a finishing school, an ability to, or my desire to refine my technique, as well as refine my ability to teach as I have residents and fellows joining me often. So that's kind of what I looked for in the fellowship. So it was truly a finishing school for me for anterior hips.
And Michael, you're coming from the UK, where obviously many of us know that anterior approach hip surgery is just not terribly common. So what does the AHF Traveling Fellowship represent to you now that you've been through it?
I think 2 things. Firstly, similarly to Jeremy, I finished up my Canadian fellowship having trained with 4 fantastic bosses and seen the use of a table, on table, off table, capsule preserving, capsule excising. And I wasn't really clear in my mind as to which technique I wanted to take into my own practice back in the UK for when I started. So it was an opportunity to see a breadth of practice across the States and to cherry pick from that what I think is the best. And actually, in all fairness, the practice has been remarkably similar across the breadth of the States. And secondly, I think it provides a real gravitas to, I've thus far taken the proposal to do anterior hips in my elective centre through 4 committees. I have another 2 committees on Tuesday, and being able to say that last summer I had this real privilege of undertaking the traveling fellowship and seeing the greats of North American hip surgery and learning from them, I think gives real credibility to introducing the practice in a safe and sensible fashion back in the UK.
Mm-hmm. And Qais, why don't you tell us your perspective?
I think, especially like what Jeremy said, like being in an academic practice, you have this obligation to kind of stay at the forefront of knowledge. And, when I came back to join my practice, I was the only one doing anterior. So anything that I did was new. So, but after about 4 or 5 years, it starts to get a little dull in the sense that you don't know if how you are doing things is the best way. So, and I've been to a bunch of courses and even been involved in the faculty of some, but you don't get the same knowledge and the same depth of the experience when you're in a lab. So I just felt that just being in the role that I am, I owed it to both my own self and everybody that I teach, that I have to keep my skills fresh. And why not go and learn from the highest volume, most efficient and experienced surgeons? And the key to it is that everybody's anterior. And so if you're doing some other type of traveling fellowship, the experiences may not be what you want, but this is so honed in and so detailed just for the anterior hip. It just felt like an opportunity that I didn't want to miss.
And Alex, I wanted to ask you, because you've been not only a host, but you were effectively one of the first traveling fellows with the Anterior Hip Foundation very early on, before it was a formal thing. What does the AHF Traveling Fellowship represent to you now that you've hosted it?
That's a great question, Joe. It really is interesting to be on the other side of it, because when I went through, as you said, visiting other faculty and board members, it really changed my practice. It exposed me to something I otherwise would not have, being in private practice. And to have that support throughout the learning curve was really meaningful to me. And it really didn't interrupt my practice. And so now, as a host, our goal from all the faculty are to expose these fellows to as many advanced technologies and techniques in both primary and revision anterior hip replacement that we can, among a diverse group of faculty and programs really across the country. So we're hoping these fellows will learn new skills and protocols that are meaningful to them and things that they can immediately implement in their practice as soon as they return home.
And gentlemen, I want to kind of throw a couple of open questions to you, and if it speaks to you, please feel free to answer. But what originally motivated you to apply for this type of fellowship?
I'm happy to start. I think I'd echo what Qais had said, in that once you're a few years into practice, things potentially can become stagnant, or at least you understand what your own outcomes can be, but maybe the world around you has moved forward. And I think we owe it to our patients to keep up with the most advanced techniques. And so um, that was kind of what motivated me. And then I think, again, because I work in the Canadian system, a public academic system with incredible inefficiencies. Another thing I wanted to learn on the fellowship was how efficient the different surgeons could be inside and outside the operating room. And we certainly saw that at every step of the way.
Yeah, I think also the being in an academic place, we don't always get the exposure to what's, the newest tech, the newest implants. And, you just always feel like you need to wait a few more years until these things are already, I guess, been established. And to go and see the leaders in the field in both efficiency, volume, and education, it kind of emboldens you to be able to go use it. The funny thing is like once I started to hear myself sounding like an old school surgeon, like, oh, I would never use that thing. I don't need that. And then I'm like, well, now I sound like all the old heads. So at this point, I guess it's time to go back to school.
Michael, you had mentioned sort of the gravitas that came with being able to say you had done this fellowship. Was that originally what you were thinking about or what motivated you to apply, or was it something else?
So I was very fortunate in that the year I spent in Canada, I had a supported visit to the Anterior Hip Foundation meeting in Nashville in 2024. And of course, remember meeting you there. And it was actually that meeting that inspired me to then apply for the Traveling Fellowship, the prospect of spending time with the various surgeons on the tracks, but also the fellows' presentations from the first year at the meeting in 2024 were simply phenomenal. And I just sat there in the audience and thought, I have to get myself in their shoes if at all possible. So from that moment, I was planning on applying.
So let's talk a little bit more about that. So the fellows at the end of their traveling fellowship come to it finishes at the annual meeting of the Anterior Hip Foundation. And there's some activities. You get to present your what your experience was like. And you get to basically share with the rest of the AHF community what you learned and what you experienced. What was that like?
So I think in terms of having been in the audience, it was seeing this extraordinary opportunity that the first year of fellows had, and in particular being struck by things like Charlie de Cook's 12 by 12, and as coming from a system where our aim is to get four primary joints done in an all-day list, the concept of 12 by 12 seems simply extraordinary and something you have to see to believe. And in fact, when we ultimately got to Charlie, we saw 16 by 11, which was, again, something you simply have to see to believe. And then being on the other side of it, this summer was rather bizarre insofar as the 2 weeks of traveling across the States, you're just discombobulated by everything you've seen in such a short space of time and the distance that you've traveled. And then all of a sudden you're up on stage in front of an enormous audience trying to distill it into something that you can communicate across. And I'm still processing the 2 weeks, if I'm completely honest.
I think the one thing that I would add is we know other orthopedic organizations run traveling fellowships, right? And I think without having done any of them, but knowing colleagues who have gone on different traveling fellowships, I think the one thing that the AHF Traveling Fellowship allows is a quick, heavy clinical experience. After we reflected on that, I think we had probably seen more cases in the 2 weeks than, other organizations would allow in their traveling fellowships. So I think it, when we created the presentation at the end and reflected on it, you really realize how much you see over that time. And I think that stimulated a lot of chatter between trainees, like fellows who attended the conference and other surgeons asking about it, because I think lots are familiar with traveling fellowships with other organizations. And this is, certainly in its infancy, and I think it's exciting because it's in its infancy. It's only going to get better, So it was good to reflect on that. And I think the one thing from a technique standpoint, because you go through the 2 weeks and the audience kind of wants you to give them a formula. Okay, how do you do an anterior hip now? Or how will you do it after working with all these high volume guys? I still can't give that answer, but what I think we could say is there are many consistencies across the table between the surgeons that we worked with.
Your response kind of raises a question for me, Jeremy, and maybe some of you feel this way, maybe all of you feel this way, but was there something that you were expecting, or was there a way that you thought the fellowship would go where your perception after it was done was different, meaning you sort of changed what you thought about the fellowship from before it started until after it was finished?
I really didn't know what to expect. I just thought that just exposure to these well-known names and centers would be enough. I was actually surprised on how hands-on it was. I do think it adds and a priceless amount of value in order to be scrubbed in and really be a part of the surgeries. And I mean, we've all been to courses and stuff, and it's hard not to just, you're in there 5 minutes, you're watching another person do work on a cadaver. It's not real, and you kind of zone out. You'll pick up little points here and there, and then you kind of just start looking around because you're not really scrubbed in. It's not a real patient. So it's hard to maintain the amount of focus throughout. But these are real patients, these are real surgeries, and you're in there in real time. And one point about the culmination of it, it was intriguing that at every spot we went to, everyone was asking how the other surgeon would do this or do that, and that is a highlight in that even those surgeons are trying to keep honing in all of their skills. And if they're doing that, then we are actually the bearers of knowledge throughout that process, and we are helping their academic process keep going.
That's sort of fascinating. Michael or Jeremy, did either of you have that sense that you were sort of conveyors of knowledge from one site to the next as well?
Yeah, we definitely talked about it over the course of the 2 weeks, and we sort of almost wondered whether we had a duty of confidentiality between the various sites, or whether it was okay to share. But I think on balance, there is a real kinship in the Anterior Hip Foundation of sharing techniques and sharing expertise. So it was a bit of a privilege to be a conduit for that, if only to say, well, you guys are pretty similar.
So you didn't catch any flack for sharing information between sites?
Not as far as I know. But seeing similar things was really great as well. I came into the Traveling Fellowship convinced that off-table, no fluoro was the best way of doing an anterior hip. And seeing, therefore, starting off with Alex in Fremont, and seeing use of the Hannah table and seeing use of fluoro and OrthoGrid AI, I was cynical to start with, and as we moved across the country and I saw it again and again, and saw it used in subtly different ways but still fundamentally the same, I was a complete convert. And I'm pleased to say that Mizuho and I have been chatting since, and it's looking like a Hannah table's on its way to the UK for April 2026.
Did that surprise you? That can be a major sort of strategic shift in how you approach doing anterior approach hip replacements. Was that sort of insight or experience something that you expected, or was that a surprise to you?
It was a surprise. I'm fairly stubborn, I think, in life, and realizing that being open-minded and then being open to change was a really important part of the 2 weeks.
Yeah. Jeremy, how did that affect you, or how did your experience, if any, change the way that you were doing anterior approach?
Well, it's interesting because prior to the fellowship, I have been using the table, and I actually wanted to come into the fellowship to see off table, and so I was hoping that we'd come across a surgeon who didn't use the table. But then after the end of the 2 weeks, I thought, nope, table is absolutely the way to go, and again, it's not to say that an anterior hip can't be done off table, but it reinforced what I had seen, and in learning from all the surgeons, and seeing how they implement their technology, their enabling tech with the table, for example, I think was really beneficial to just cement that, the technique that I've been doing, I can just continue on that and refine it. I don't have to make a huge switch, I think. So that was certainly a valuable part of the fellowship.
Do you think if the AHF had offered both a table track and an off-table track, you would have had the same type of experience, or you would have chosen off-table, or how would you have approached that?
In hindsight, I probably, I'm happy the way that it was set up, because like I said, I can make small incremental change, and it reinforced what I'd known. If I think if you had set that up and I hadn't done the fellowship, I probably would have chased the off table track, for example. But again, if you work with high volume surgeons, right? And so these are surgeons doing over 1,000 hips a year, right? Which, is probably the highest in the world. And if they're doing it a certain way, there's a reason, right? And they don't need to strong arm you to convince you that. You watch them work for a day or two, and you get it. It's pretty simple.
Qais, was there anything that surprised you of something that you took away from the fellowship, something that you took away that you saw sort of systematically throughout the fellowship?
Yeah, in my practice, there wasn't a capsule that I didn't cut, and I cut it out, and I kept taking more and more, and I felt that early on, that it would have helped me to not have that as a barrier for exposure and stuff. And I thankfully haven't had an instability problem almost ever, so it wasn't a reason. But then I saw everyone basically, they kept the capsule or they tagged it, and there was an elegance to it that I hadn't appreciated. So now I absolutely keep all the capsule, and I just felt like I needed to add things to how I do things, and that was one of them. I love the Hannah table. That's what I was using anyway at most of the hospitals that I was working at. There's one hospital that we didn't have a Hannah table, and I had to like learn how to do it off table. But the and I could see both arguments, but most of the arguments that come with saying, "Oh, you don't need the table, you don't need fluoro." Well, we don't need iPhones and we don't need the internet, but if you're not using the most up to date and advanced tools, then I think that says more about your needs of your ego than it does about the actual surgery. And being able to see high volume surgeons use these things that maybe you think might slow you down, it adds to the process of it. So you can use the table, and you can use fluoro, and you can use orthogrid, and you can use all these tools, and it could make you more efficient, make you more safe, not just slow you down or add cost.
Did any of you experience any, we'll say, doubts as you were entering into the fellowship, or were there any concerns that you had with the schedule, or maybe more broadly, were there any sort of career or professional trade-offs that you had to make in order to pursue this fellowship?
I mean, I think certainly taking time off of busy practice is certainly not an easy feat when you're on a call schedule and you have different obligations. And then not only that, obligations at home. For example, I know we all have young kids now, so those aren't easy feats. But I think the one forgiving thing about the traveling fellowship was that it was short and succinct. I think 2.5 weeks was a perfect amount of time. I think if it would have been a month long, it would have been a much harder pill to swallow to apply and want to do it, I think. So, and again, it wasn't just one or two sites right over the course of 3 days. I think it was a good amount of time to be able to do that. So I was certainly a bit anxious as I was leaving my practice for 2.5 weeks saying, I hope this is worth it. And then, within a few days, you meet your co-fellows, you meet the surgeons who are truly there to, they're truly a humble group of surgeons as much as they're big name surgeons. They're not there to try and make a name. They're there to bounce ideas off of. And so that kind of just reinforced, it's a right decision and to take time away from practice, and now that we're 6 months out of the fellowship, I'm very glad that, you took dedicated time off to do that. And I think you need to take dedicated time off to do it. This is much different than just going to a weekend course to learn a technique. As Qais had said, the stakes aren't as high when you're working on a cadaver and you have 8 conversations going around, right? So I think this is a great experience for that reason, and shed that apprehension that I had going for it.
Alex, from your perspective as a host, what do you hope fellows gain when they come to visit your practice?
Joe, as you can see from these fellows, they're all motivated, they're eager to learn, they're open-minded, so they really came to absorb as much as they could from the various sites. And what we really hope is we're not trying to convert them to do exactly the way we do things, but we're hoping that they will pick up a little bit at the first site, a little more at the second site, maybe things they like or don't like at the third site. But that way they can formulate a protocol and a plan specific for them, what they like, and bring it back to their practice that they can implement the following day or the following week when they return home. So our goal as hosts are really just to provide them as much exposure as possible, answer any questions they have, show them anything that they want to see so that we can really personalize their experience to them.
Michael, can you share a moment where you thought, this is exactly why I applied to this fellowship? Did a moment like that occur to you?
I think it did, and I think it occurred again and again and again. And I came into the fellowship thinking that I had to find out what was wrong with me as a surgeon to become more efficient. How do I get more cases done without compromising on quality? And I wanted to meet people like Alex and work out how I could be more like them in what I was doing. And there was a real moment where I realized I had it completely wrong. And actually what Alex and all of the other surgeons across the track have done is they have built teams around them, people who can set a patient up properly, who can close a wound properly, who can do all of the other components that you need in the day to allow Alex to be the person who delivers 10 or 11 great joints because he's got that team around him. And that was a real moment of going, okay, I get it now. That's what I have to do.
Qais, was there a moment or was there something that surprised you the most once the fellowship actually started?
I'm fortunate that we got paired up with 2 excellent guys here, and even more fortunate that we were on track 1 or what I call varsity, and that the experience from day 1 you're on. And just to add a little bit to what Jeremy was saying, it's been 5 or 6 months now, and you can't really look back and say, how could this have been done any better, or there's no way it could have been shorter and it still be as meaningful. When you think of fellowship for a whole year, half of that year you're over it already. You just want to get out on your own and go and start practice. So if you, and we don't have that time to go and do another year of fellowship, well, and we probably don't need that. But in the 2.5 weeks, I thought it was a perfect amount of time. I'm not sure how it could have been done any better. It was just a digestible amount of knowledge, because anything more would have been a burden probably on your home life or on your practice. But I think you guys hit that sweet spot with how much experience and knowledge is both useful and practical.
That's a good place to pause for today. In this first part of the conversation, we've talked about where this fellowship begins, the expectations, the early impressions, and the moments that start to shape how you see hip surgery, as well as the community around it. But in part 2, we go further. We talk about what actually changes along the way, the cases that stick with you, the conversations that challenge your assumptions, and how the fellowship experience influences the way these surgeons think about their practice moving forward. So make sure you're subscribed wherever you're listening, because part 2 of this conversation drops next week. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the AHF Podcast. You can find the AHF Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or in any of your favorite podcast apps, as well as in video form on YouTube /@Anterior Hip Foundation, all one word. Episodes of the AHF Podcast come out on Fridays. I'm your host, Joe Schwab, asking you to keep those hips happy and healthy.